Hi everyone, I hope you're doing all great. Welcome to my channel, I'm Birgit from Koba.Siani. In today's video I'd like to show you my new pattern. And this time it's not, the pattern is not standing for itself, it's an add-on pattern. And it's a skirt for all my t-shirt patterns. So that means as a result of this sewing project we're talking about dresses. And if you'd like to sew one of these dresses, you have to purchase the skirt add-on pattern, Lady, and one of the top patterns, Mila, Emma or Johanna. But of course these are also available as pattern bundles. If you're interested, just click the links below in the description box. With the skirt pattern Lady, the possibilities are really almost endless. You have just so many options. So at first, let me explain these. At first, you can choose between the three top patterns. Here, for example, I'm wearing a Lady Emma dress, means the top is the pattern Emma. Then we have the top pattern Mila, this here, and the top pattern Johanna. Within the Mila and the Johanna pattern, of course, there are also several options within the top patterns. So that means for the Mila we have the 2 cups option or the option with one chest piece only, and for the Johanna we have really many options. We have 2 different colors. We have a gathered side seam or a non-gathered side seam, and you can also sew the Johanna without any color, like this here. So when you've decided which top pattern to choose, then you can proceed with the skirt pattern. For the lady skirt, at first you have 2 different lengths. Here I'm wearing the floor length. This is really long. And we have also a midi length, like this here. Then you have 3 different options for the waist seam. At first a straight waist seam, like this here. Then a pointed waist seam, like I'm wearing here. I know it's not that obvious on the dark fabric, but it's like this here, like a V. And we have a rounded waist seam, like on this dress here. Then you have the choice between a non-gathered skirt, which is quite tight here around the hips, or a skirt with gatherings like on this dress here. And then you have the choice in between making the skirt part in one piece only, like this, or with seams and slits in the center front. But I have to say, this is not always optional. This also depends on your size and your fabric width. So that means if you're wearing a bigger size and have a narrower fabric width, it can be that you have to make seams here and also in the center back. But of course you can close the seams completely so that it doesn't add to the design itself. But you can also sew the lady skirt with slits, 1 or 2 slits. You can make simple slits, or you can add a zipper to your slit so that the height of the slit is flexible. In the back of the dress combination you have this lacing here, which is sometimes optional, but also sometimes necessary, especially if your skirt is heavy, means you're making the long skirt with heavy fabric, with gatherings, so that adds up to the weight. And then in this case the skirt is dragging down the dress, and to make it fit properly with the lacing you can make the skirt or the dress really tight here so that it stays here at the waistline where it should be. But for fabrics which are quite stable lengthwise, for example cotton elastan jerseys and the midi skirt without gathering, the lacing is optional. In doubt you can also sew this and later cut the loops if you feel this is too much or not necessary. I think the Lady Mila, Lady Emma or Lady Johanna dresses are really quite perfect to make costumes for cosplay or medieval inspired costumes, or also some witchy costumes like this here. But depending on the skirt option, you can also sew with the pattern combinations quite nice dresses for every day. Here are some examples for these kinds of dresses. So, design-wise, it's totally up to you. Just be creative. Because of the many options, there's also a high difference between the sewing levels of the different options. Let me just say that the Lady Emma with a straight waistline and no slits is probably the most simple one and is also suited for sewing beginners. This is really a quick and easy project, especially if you'd like to explore your overlock sewing machine. So perhaps you've already found your favorite top and skirt combination. Get yourself a lady pattern and a magic top pattern, and let's start with this sewing project. Have fun! As you can perhaps imagine, we cannot jump right into cutting the fabric. At first, the top pattern has to be adapted. I just wanted to mention here some things. At first, and I think this is quite clear already, but just to erase any doubts, the lady skirt pattern is for elastic jersey fabrics. And these jersey fabrics have to have an elastan content of minimum 5%. Above all, the elasticity of your fabric has to be suitable for your specific top pattern. Especially for Emma and Johanna, the elasticity of the fabric is very important. If you are not sure, you can test your fabric. I'll put the instruction video for the elasticity test also into the lady playlist and link it for you here. More information you'll find in the instructions of the top patterns. What you'll find in the lady instruction is, of course, a size chart so that you can easily pick your size. This time also the pattern adaptations are quite easy. These you'll also find in the instruction. Now just a few words to the pattern itself. If you're printing your lady pattern at home, you can print out the file with DNA 4 in the name, but this layout also fits on US letter size paper. If you're not familiar with my patterns or DNA 4 patterns in general, I link you here a general and detailed instruction video about my DNA 4 or US letter size patterns. This time there also happened a novelty about my DNA 0 pattern. The pattern pieces for the long lady with gatherings were so big so that I couldn't fit them on the width of DNA 0, so this time I had to make it in 2 pages. There is one gluing line here, and if you're making the long version, you should glue the pattern together along this line. In general, both DNA 4 and DNA 0 patterns are this time separated in non-gathered lady and gathered lady, just to make the pattern more clear. So now let's talk about the pattern preparations for the top parts. Here it is very important to have a waistline in the pattern. For Emma and Johanna this is already the case because these are one of my newer patterns, but for the Mila pattern we have to draw in the waistline at first. We take now the front and back pattern pieces and measure a distance here called A from the hemline at the center back and center front upwards. From there we draw a straight line in the 90-degree angle across the pattern. Because of the grading, this distance A is different for the sizes, so just pause the video to read the distance for your size. Next, we measure 1 centimeter upwards from this line on at the side seam. Then the waistline can be drawn in. Here it's marked in green, starting with a 90-degree angle at the center front and center back, and then continuing in a slight curve upwards towards the side seams. Now we are on the same level, we have a waistline in the pattern. For a straight waist seam, all you have to do now is to add the seam allowance here. As always for elastic seams, this is 7 mm. With the seam allowance, the top pattern is now already prepared and the lower part can be cut off or folded away. For both the pointed and curved waist seam, there are templates which should be put along the waist seam of the top pattern. Please make sure you use the correct one, depending on whether you have gatherings in the side seam of the top or not. You can just glue the template to the waistline and then cut the paper, like I'm doing it here. But with a little trick, you can keep your top pattern untouched. You just fold the lower part along the waistline upwards, and then you pin your template underneath along the waistline. Like this, you can cut your top pattern pieces for a lady dress, and later reuse the pattern pieces for a normal top. By the way, for the back top, there is only one template for both the pointed and the curved waist seam.
Matching to the top adaptation, the right waistline at the skirt part has to be used now. In this example, it's the pointed waist seam. So either you cut the skirt pattern along this line or you fold away the part that is not needed. As you can see it, I really like to do this a lot because this keeps my patterns flexible so that the next time when I saw a lady, for example, with a curved waist seam, I still can use the same paper pattern without printing it again. I always cut into the pattern towards the line which should be folded. So like this, I can more or less fold along the curve. As you can see it here on the pattern pieces on the left, the two narrow ones, I'm making a lady with a slit. So I've already cut the front skirt pattern piece along the line which is drawn in the pattern. This line is for slits, dividing seams, and cases means sizes where the pattern piece is too big for the fabric width. The same trick, I mean folding away the pattern areas I don't need, I'm again using for the hemline. Here, for example, I'm sewing or preparing a midi version. So I cut into the hem towards the line and then I fold the lower part of the skirt away, which I don't need at the moment. Later, I can fold it back and use the pattern again for a maxi skirt if I want to. Now finally, the pattern pieces can be cut. I've made a quite detailed plan how to cut the pattern pieces, and it's best to follow these plans so that your fabric consumption will be as low as possible. You'll find these cutting suggestions in the written sewing instruction. Here, by the way, I'm cutting a lady that has only one pattern piece for the front and back. But for the case you'd like to make a slit in the front part or two slits, the front pattern piece is in two parts. And along this slit, you should add 1 centimeter seam allowance for slits. And if you'd only like to make a dividing seam, 7 millimeter is enough. Here I've pinned both front pattern pieces with a parallel distance of 2 centimeter. Like this, automatically the grain line of the pattern piece at the side seam is correct. And if I cut right at the center of this 2 centimeter distance, I've added my 1 centimeter seam allowance on each side. Besides the pattern pieces, which you have on hand on paper, we also need some other pieces. If you're making the lacing in the back, you need now a fabric strip which should be 3.5 centimeter wide, preferably cut parallel to the selvage of the fabric. The total length is different for the different sizes. Just pause here to read your length. Here it's only important that the total length of the fabric strip is enough. You can also cut it in several pieces and sew these together later. Then, in case you make a pointed or curved waist seam and you have a gathered side seam in your top part, you need now the top template for the front top, the one for a non-gathered side seam, of course in the matching shape, curved or pointed, cut once on fold out of simple parchment paper. Please don't be confused, I'm using here another material, but I've made some more tests and parchment paper works very well. This is for later for the gathered front part to fix it in its final shape. If you're making a slit, whether with zipper or without zipper, you will need a 1.5 centimeter wide strip of soft interlining for the stabilization of the fabric edges. For each slit, the length of these tapes should be 1.6 meter for a midi skirt or 2.2 meter for a long skirt. If you're adding a zipper to your slit, you can also add a piping to the zipper edges, what I'd really recommend. Then you'll need an additional set of fabric strips with again the width of 3.5 centimeter and a lengthwise grain line and an approximate length of 55 centimeter, but you can also cut these two strips later when your zipper measurements are defined. At first, let's have a look on the front parts, what has to be marked there. For the top part, the Emma pattern is shown here as an example. At first, we need the center front on both the top and the skirt part, of course. If you like to, you can also mark the hem. Then, the edges of a slit have to be reinforced with a strip of interlining. There are ready tapes for this, but as you've seen it before, I've cut my own. This I'm just ironing on along the edges. with its gluing side to the wrong fabric side. This will improve the lengthwise stability of the fabric. This is quite important when we top stitch the slit later or when we sew in the zipper. If you've chosen the pointed waistline, the corner at the skirt part also needs to be reinforced with a small piece of interlining. This is because of the incision we have to do later. Additionally, the seam line has to be drawn on now onto the wrong fabric side of the top and the skirt part. Again, this is only for the pointed waist seam. Only a small area in the center front is enough. And as we have a seam allowance of 7 mm there, draw a line now with a 7 mm distance from the fabric edge, just like it's marked here in green. We also need on both top and skirt again the marking for the tip. These are marked in red here. If you're sewing the top with a gathered side seam, you also need to mark a line at the center front. This line begins at the height of the notches, beginning of gathering, which are located on the side seam. As this may sound a little bit complicated, I'm showing you here how I do this marking in real life. By the way, especially for the Johanna with a gathered side seam, there is really much extra length in the top part. So if you'd like to add the stabilization elastic band also in the back, please add the same marking line in the center back. But this is up to you. Especially for viscose fabrics, this could be interesting. The fabric just looks a little bit neater. On the left you can see the back without gathering, and on the right with the sewn-in elastic band. In the back part, again, we need markings for the center back at the top and the skirt, and also the hem. If you've planned a lacing in the back, we're now preparing the tie for it. At first, if you've cut it in several pieces, we're joining them with a simple straight stitch, then trimming down the seam allowance and press it apart with the fingers. Of course, a diagonal joining seam is also possible, or even better, but this time it's not so important. Then this long fabric strip is folded lengthwise to the half with the wrong fabric side to the outside, and the open edges are stitched together. In this seam we also sew in a narrow elastic band. This gives the tie the needed stability. I'm using a transparent silicone elastic band from Elastic. This is why you can hardly see it here, but you can also use a normal elastic band. Afterwards, this fabric tube can be turned over to the right fabric side with the help of a safety pin. Next, the top can be sewn up to the chapter side seam and underarm seam, because here at the side seam we'd like to add the loops now. But of course you can skip this step if you are sure you don't need any loops and lacing in the back. But back to the loops, I'm cutting now here 4.5 cm long pieces out of the band we've produced before. Then I'm folding these in half and pin them to the side seam. Of course, the open edges point to the side seam and the loops point to the center front or center back. The first loop I'm pinning 1 cm above the fabric edge, means these will be directly at the waist seam. The second pair of loops I'm pinning 5 cm above the first pair of loops if you don't have a gathered side seam, and if you have one, 7.5 cm above the first loops. Depending on your fabric, it can make sense to baste the loops at first, so that they don't slip away while you're sewing the side seam. If your side seam is without gathering, you can just close it now, but really sew carefully here, because with the loops, the fabric layers really add up, and it's quite easy to break a needle like this. With an ungathered side seam, you can already go ahead with the next chapter after this step. If you're making a gathered side seam at the top part, of course, there are some more details to it. With the elimination of the lower part of the top, there is no whole side seam to be gathered now. The section is much smaller. This means the distance to which the side seam section has to be gathered now has of course changed. You can pause now again the video to read the distance for your size. What you'll notice in this chart is that the distances for the t-shirt pattern Mila above size 48 are really quite tiny. This is because of the position of the waistline and the pattern grading. So if you fall into these sizes, you can think about to skip the gathering and to only sew in a firm woven tape into the side seam for stabilization. especially for soft viscose fabrics. In general, it can be helpful to rather use a firm woven tape for the side seam gathering instead of the elastic band, which is originally mentioned for the side seam gathering for the tops, because this helps for the lengthwise stability of the dress. Speaking of stabilization, we'll also add now an elastic band at the center front, and if you'd like to, also in the center back, to keep the waist seam where it should be when wearing the dress. For this, the body is now put in irregular pleats, just how it's defined by the gathering at the side seam. The lower edge of the top is now more or less a straight line. Then an elastic band is pinned at the top of the center front marking line. And then this elastic band is cut around 2 cm below the fabric edge. These protruding 2 cm will help to grasp the elastic band properly while sewing it on. And here I'm doing this. As the elastic band is sewn to the inside of the dress, here it's important to have a matching lower thread in the sewing machine. While sewing the elastic band on, I'm taking care that I stay on the center front marking with my seam, and I stretch out the elastic band while sewing. For this, you don't need an exact measurement. Just take care that at the end, the 2 cm of the elastic band are still protruding the fabric edge. If you'd like to, you can repeat now this step at the center back. And if you're making the straight waist seam, you're now ready to go to the next chapter. For the pointed and the curved waistline, there are a few more sewing steps. For these waist seam shapes, the gathering continues downwards to the lower edge at the center front. So at first, this lower section has to be brought in shape, and for this we need now the template in the corresponding shape, of course, out of parchment paper. If you've chosen, for example, the curved waist seam, the matching template is the one with a curved waist seam, but for non-gathered tops. Here, in these sections of the curve, gathering seams are now added, so that the extra length in the lower section of the top part can be gathered. This is what happens here. These gathering seams are done with the regular household sewing machine with a straight stitch with the maximum stitch length. The thread ends and beginnings are hanging loose, and the distance from the fabric edge to the stitching is around 5 mm. Then one of the threads can be pulled and the fabric is gathered. This is done until the shape of the fabric matches the shape of the paper template. The template is now also pinned to the wrong side of the fabric. To secure these gatherings, the fabric is now stitched to the paper, again around 5 mm away from the edge, so that this seam will later be invisible. It's best to sew from the fabric side, because like this you still control the gathering while sewing. Now we can continue with adding the elastic band in the center front. Here too I'm putting the front part in irregular pleats like the gathering at the side seam defines it. The lower part of the top is now also led in pleats, but this is already controlled by the template. Here I pin the elastic band to the center front marking, and again I'm cutting it around 2 cm below the fabric edge. The paper is now ripped open at the center front because the stitching of the elastic band shouldn't go through the paper. Then the elastic band can be stitched to the center front, again at the inside of the dress. Here, by the way, with the green dress I'm sewing a Johanna top, and here the gatherings are much stronger than with the Mila top, so here I also have to pull the elastic band while sewing much more. Again, there is no exact measurement how much to pull the elastic band. Just make sure that when you reach the lower edge of the fabric, you still hold these around 2 cm extra length of the elastic band in your fingers. After finishing this seam, the parchment paper can be gently pulled away from the fabric. And if you like to, you can also now add the elastic band in the center back. But here the lower section of the top in the back doesn't have a special template. The gathering doesn't continue until the lower edge of the fabric. Okay, so now let's prepare the skirt. For this video, I've sorted all the vertical seams from simple to more difficult. This will be the order now how I'll show them to you. But of course, if you've planned any slit in your skirt, please make the slit at first and then pass to the simple seams like the side seams or perhaps the center back seam. There's also to say that even if you don't want to make a slit, you might have some dividing seams in the front and back. This depends on your chosen size and your fabric width. In my sewing sample here, I have only the side seams to close in the skirt, so this represents all the simple seams in the skirt in the video. Just pin the fabric together, right sides facing. Then these seams can be closed and afterwards be ironed. Dividing seams in the front part are ironed towards the center front. The side seams are ironed towards the back part, and the center back seam, if you have any, you can iron in any direction you'd like to. On the next sewing sample, I'd like to make a simple slit. I've already closed one of the dividing seams. The slit edges are already reinforced with a strip of interlining, and the same edges I've also already overcasted separately. Then I can measure downwards from the top edge how long the seam here has to be closed, means the height of the slit. This measurement is totally up to you. The best is you measure this on yourself in front of a mirror, down from the waistline. If you'd like to make it like my dress, I've used 40 centimeter here. I then mark this spot on both edges. Then I pin both panels, of course with the right fabric sides facing. Afterwards, the seam above the slit can be closed. This I'm doing with the straight stitch of the household sewing machine. Also, like prepared before, when cutting the fabric, with 1 centimeter seam allowance. As a next step, this seam allowance is pressed apart. The slit edges are folded, pressed and pinned for 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side, just following the direction of the pressed apart seam allowance. Afterwards, 2 stitchings are done, on both sides of the seam and the slit. These stitchings go from the upper edge all the way down to the hem, and they hold the seam allowance at the upper part in place, and of course they finish the slit. In the end of the slit is secured by a bar tag. Just sew with a straight stitch a few times forth and back. Next, I'll show you the slit with zipper. Here too, the fabric edges where the slit and the zipper will be are already reinforced with a strip of interlining and they are already overcasted. Then we have to measure and mark a few spots. Again, these measurements can be seen totally flexible. With my example here, your dress will look like this. When the zipper is open, the slit is really quite high. And when the zipper is closed, which is 40 centimeters by the way, the slit is rather low. At first, I'm marking the zipper beginning on both zipper sides. This is right at the zipper pull, because of course the zipper is now upside down. Then I'm measuring 50 centimeter downwards from the top edge of the fabric and mark this on the wrong fabric side. This I'm doing on both sides on both front panels. Then, from this point, I'm measuring 30 centimeter upwards, again on both sides, and I mark this point. On the zipper, I measure the same 30 centimeter upwards, measured from the mark of the zipper beginning. Here, also make sure that the marking is on both sides of the zipper tape. Then, the zipper is pinned with its right side to the right fabric side. The edges of the fabric and the zipper tape are aligning. I start here at the zipper beginning and I'm also aligning the mark for the zipper beginning and the 50 centimeter mark. At the top, I'm also aligning both markings on the zipper and the fabric. Then the zipper can be opened and the other side of the zipper or the other zipper band can be pinned to the other fabric edge. In detail, later when it's pinned, this looks like this here. The tape edge is at the fabric edge and the zipper teeth are pointing inwards. Then the zipper can be sewn to the fabric, but only here from notch to notch. As we are using an invisible zipper, it's best to use a special sewing foot for sewing the zipper on. This sewing foot has an extra space for the zipper teeth underneath, so that you can sew just beside the zipper teeth. As defined per the width of the zipper tape, the seam allowance here is automatically 1 centimeter. If you don't have this special zipper sewing foot, don't worry, this also works with a regular zipper sewing foot. This I'll show you here on the second zipper side. Here I've already changed the sewing foot and brought the needle to the position totally at the left. I'm trying to get as near as possible to the zipper teeth, and while sewing I'm pushing the teeth a little bit open so that the needle can get there. It's only a little bit dangerous, so if you're sewing like this, please make sure that you don't sew into your fingers. But no matter which sewing foot you're using, it's really important here that you only sew from mark to mark. The more exactly you work here, the better the result will be. Afterwards, the seam section above the zipper can be closed. Here I'm preparing the seam and pinning the fabric edges right side to right side together. The zipper end I'm just putting to the side. Here the zipper is now also closed. Then I'm sewing starting at the top edge. Of course, here again with 1 centimeter seam allowance. As soon as I come near the zipper, I pull the end away and try to sew as near as possible to the seam end of the zipper seam, means the marking there. Please also take care that the seam allowances lay flat and nicely so that you don't sew a pleat there. The next step is optional, but in my opinion worth it, as the edges of the slit tend to turn outwards when wearing the dress. It's quite nice to neaten the edges of the zipper with pipings. You can either add those pipings only at the zipper, or you can sew them all the way up to the upper fabric edge. As the original clips were really very bad and you could see nothing, I'm showing you this here on this mock-up here. Of course, you have to imagine that the fabric continues downwards to the hem and upwards to the waist seam. Here you can see the zipper. Of course, we continue now on the wrong side of the skirt part. Also, for this working step, I'm opening the zipper. Then you take tape, which is cut out of the fabric itself, with the width of 3.5 centimeter and the needed length, of course. The grain line of the fabric is parallel to the long side of the tape. At first, the zipper tape at the zipper ending is folded to the side like this and secured with a pin. Then the fabric tape is pinned on. You can fold the short edge of the band a little bit to the wrong fabric side, but only if your fabric is thin enough. For this one here, this would be possible, but for example for the stretch velvet of my dark dress, this would be too thick. As jerseys anyways don't fray very much, or even not at all, this is possible without any problems. The tape is now pinned with its right fabric side behind the zipper, means to the wrong side of the fabric of the skirt part. The fabric edges are of course aligning. As already mentioned, you can pin this band only to the zipper or continue with it all the way up. Then the band can be sewn on with the zipper sewing foot, of course. The needle position is here completely at the left. It's better to sew on the side with the zipper tape, because like this the fabric isn't stretched out when sewing, as the zipper tape is not flexible. I'm sewing here with around 7 mm seam allowance. Then this corner of the zipper tape can be cut now. I'm not doing this because I'd like to use the zipper later for another project. I'm just folding it away. Then the loose edge of the fabric band can be folded once to the wrong fabric side and then wrapped around the zipper tape and pinned like this. The zipper tape edge is now completely covered by the fabric band. As soon as the whole piping is prepared with pins, it can be stitched closed. This is what you see me doing here. Unfortunately, as the piping fabric is, of course, out of jersey fabric, which is elastic, the fabric is now stretching out a little bit while sewing. To make it glide better under the sewing foot, I'm helping a little bit with the pins. As you can see, I'm pressing a little bit down the fabric with a pin so that no pleat is created while stitching the piping. Of course, all these steps are repeated on the second side of the zipper. Whether with or without pipings, we're moving now to the iron. The slit edges are now folded and pressed and pinned for 1 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side. And also the seam allowance above the slit is ironed apart. If you haven't added a piping, please make now sure to pin the zipper tape at the zipper end a little bit away from the slit edge so that it won't be visible from the outside. The other end of the zipper also has to be fixed with pins, or if you have one, it's already fixed with the piping. Then the slit edges can be stitched. This is done again with a straight regular stitch. I'm sewing with a distance of around 6 or 7 millimeter from the edge. I'm starting at the hem and continue all the way up to the waist seam. This means with this stitching, I'm finishing the slit edges and I'm also stitching down the seam allowance above the slit, including the zipper area. Like this, the seam allowance is held apart. The distance of the stitching to the slit edge and the seam has to be kept always the same, of course, and the stitching is done from the right side of the fabric. Finally, the waist seam can be closed. Of course, if you've chosen the gathered skirt, the width of the skirt part has to be gathered first to the width of the top part. You can do this with your favorite method. I'm doing this, as always, with one simple row of gathering stitching with the maximum stitch length around 5 millimeter from the fabric edge without locking the seam ends, so when you pull one of the threads, the fabric is gathered. I would only suggest to split the gathering seams here because the width is really big, means separate gathering seams for the front and back part, at least. Or if your fabric is a little bit thicker, or if you're sewing a bigger size, I would even split front and back each in 2 gathering seams. Like this, the thread won't break this easily. So here on this patterned Lady Mila dress, I'm making a straight waist seam. So here it's very easy. I only have to take care that the notches and the seams are aligning, means at the side seam and the center front and back. And when everything is pinned together with the right fabric sides facing, of course, I can sew both parts together. Please make sure here that you don't sew in the loops at the side seam. It's also better to sew with the gathered part on top. Like this, you can still control the gatherings while sewing. With the curved waist seam, which I've made for the green velvet dress, it's also quite easy. You only have to take care of the side seam and the center front, center back notches or seams. The pinned top and skirt pieces also look quite similar. With a straight skirt without gathering, of course you skip the gathering steps. For the pointed waist seam, there are some more sewing steps. At first, align the markings at the right side and the left side of the tip, at the top part and the skirt part. If you've chosen a gathered skirt, please gather also the skirt part, but the distance at the point in between the notches remains flat no matter which option you've chosen. The top part and the skirt part are now pinned together with the right fabric sides facing, except the distance between the notches at the point at the center front. This distance remains open at first. Then the pinned section can be closed. The reason why I leave the section around the tip open at first is that with the overlock sewing machine, I cannot sew any precise tips. So just in case you're sewing everything with your regular household sewing machine, it's possible to close the waist seam in only one step. Afterwards, I thread in the seam ends of the overlock seam into the overlock seam to secure the ends. Then the second section of the waist seam can be done. At first, I'm now cutting in the seam allowance of the skirt towards the tip, perhaps around 2 millimeter before the crossing of the marked seam line. Then I put both seam line tips at the top part and the skirt part on top of each other very precisely with a pin. Normally, these kind of incisions into the seam allowance are done while sewing under the sewing machine, but in this case there is not enough space to do this. Then the seam around the tip is closed with a straight stitch. I'm sewing with the skirt layer on top. Like this, I can manage the incision better. I start with the seam in the seam line of the overlock seam, then sew towards the tip, up to the marked cross, and then I turn the fabric with the needle in a downwards position and continue the seam to the other side. Again, the seam ends in the seam line of the overlock seam. Then also this waist seam option, the most difficult one from the three, is done. Finally, the hem can be prepared. The fabric edge is folded, pressed and pinned for 2 cm towards the wrong fabric side. And everywhere where vertical seams meet the hem, the seam allowance is cut into. But of course, you have to make sure not to cut into the part of the seam which really holds the fabric together. Then the 2 parts of the seam allowance are laid in opposite directions, and then the hem is pinned upwards again. Like this, the area of the seam doesn't get too thick. Then the hem is stitched, and for this there are really many possibilities. I'm lucky enough to have a cover stitch sewing machine, so I'm using this one for the hem. But you can also use a zigzag stitch, for example, or a straight stitch with elastic sewing thread, or other possibilities you can think of. By the way, my green stretch velvet dress I haven't hemmed, because this fabric doesn't fray at all, and the fabric falls better without a hem stitching. This is also why the green dress looks so long. Afterwards, I press the hem again, as it gets a bit wavy from the sewing process. Then the tie can be threaded into the loops at the side seam, of course only if you have planned this. I'm doing this like for shoes, and the ends should hang down so that the knot can be tied at the waistline. The ends of the tie you can fold in and stitch in place, but you can also just knot them to secure these. As some versions of the dress, especially with the MR or the collarless Johanna top, are really quite similar in the front and back. You can now add a label or a small embroidery in the back part, so that you will always put on your dress in the right direction.
Okay, that's it, we are ready. Thank you for watching the video and following along. I hope you've enjoyed the sewing project and that everything went well. But as always, I'm here to help you. You can drop a comment here below the video, or you can write me to info@Koba.Siani.com and I'll help you. Don't forget to leave me a thumbs up here on YouTube, this helps me a lot, or subscribe to my channel to stay tuned. But you can also follow me for more creative content on social media. I'm mainly on Instagram and Facebook. I hope to see you very soon again to my next sewing project and next sewing video. Take care until then. Bye!